Just a quick review. We know that thousands of reactions occur within the microscopic space of a living cell. Hydrolyzation, dehydration, synthesis, all of these structures, everything is driven by energy, and energy is the capacity to cause change. Okay, so thermoregulation is going to be the key biological connection to this, with the balancing of the internal temperatures and tolerable ranges and homeostasis, that endothermic versus ectothermic materials. If you remember, we looked at photosynthesis, transferring energy to the mitochondria, and the waste heat driving that entropy cycle, the laws of thermodynamics. You need to review all of those things from the earlier units. If you're confused by anything that's on this screen now, go back to unit, I think it was 3, cellular energetics, and hit some of those key points, okay, because it's going to be fundamental to the rest of this section. Overall, we need to remember that energy flows and matter cycles. Energy will flow through the ecosystem, will ultimately be lost through entropy exchanges as heat to the environment. All organisms require energy to grow, repair, reproduce, and they must obey physical laws, the laws of conservation of mass, the laws of thermodynamics. All of these things are true. These relationships between trophic levels are essential. Primary producers are going to be the main plants and things that are absorbing light energy and chemical energy and producing material from inorganic substances. Those will then be consumed by the primary consumers. The primary consumers will then be eaten by secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and so on. Everything ultimately dies and ends up as detritus, which is then decomposed through something like a fungus or a bacteria maybe, and then that matter will cycle through again. So energy flow and decomposition are the major cycles here. You don't really need consumers to cycle matter and energy. You really just need producers and decomposers. So we're sort of just a side path on that energy flow, but it's going to be part of that process. Hopefully none of this is new to you and this makes sense. Primary productivity, that's the actual energy budget that's going on within a system. So primary productivity is the synthesis of organic compounds from atmospheric or aqueous carbon dioxide. It essentially is looking mainly at photosynthesis, but also chemosynthesis to a much lesser degree. In most ecosystems, the amount of light energy is converted to chemical energy by autotrophs in a given time period through this primary productivity. And you can see sort of a global scale for that here. The amount of photosynthetic production sets the spending limit for the ecosystem, and that energy budget can then be analyzed. Formulaically, you're looking overall at net and gross energy. The net primary productivity, the NPP, is going to be equal to the gross primary production minus the energy used by the primary producers for respiration. So NPP is equal to GPP minus respiration. Therefore, the net ecosystem production, the NPP, is equal to the total gross of all photosynthetic and chemosynthetic organisms minus the respiration it takes to keep them alive. Okay, so example, a forest with a positive NPP may still lose carbon if heterozygotes release it as CO2 more quickly than primary producers can incorporate it. It's going to be part of that cycle. So we typically use the amount of CO2 as an indication of productivity, as most productivity is driven by photosynthesis and carbon fixation. There are limits to how productive an ecosystem can be, and there's been a variety of studies that try to do this. But this was so-called the law of the minimum, states that overall you're limited by what you have the least of. The availability of the most abundant nutrient in the soil is only as good as the availability of the least abundant nutrient in the soil. That's the original quote. Okay, so if we tried looking at these sort of structures, like in aquatic systems, for example, they tried enriching with different amounts of elements, and they found that adding iron was the major limiting nutrient. If they added other things, there was a small increase in most cases, but it was really iron that made the difference. Sometimes there can be too many nutrients and ecosystems can have problems. Eutrophication is when the excess nutrients are going to happen, and that's going to lead to something like an algal bloom. The algae grows like crazy because of the amount of nutrients, and that's not really a problem. But as the algae dies, it's dying faster than decomposition can take care of. So decomposition tends to accelerate, which leads to a loss of oxygen as it requires, it's an aerobic process, leading to aquatic dead zones. Other limits might be for something like rainfall for productivity of terrestrial plants. Okay, too little rain and there won't be as much productivity. Too much rain and it begins to level off again. So that there's sort of a maximum, a peak efficiencies that can go on there. So temperature, moisture, nutrient levels, all of these things are going to be limits on how productive an ecosystem can be. The transfer of food energy from its source in autotrophs through a series of organisms is going to be sort of this overall partitioning of energy. And there's a basic rule that's called the 10% rule that basically says that the 10% of energy will transfer from one trophic level to the next. Okay, so if we had this example here, like, okay, well, solar radiation, there's 600,000 units. The gross productivity from the grass is 34,000 units, and so on. Different amounts of energy are used, and we can look at that mathematically. We will in class. But overall, basically, roughly 10% of energy will pass from one level to the next. It's not really a law, it's just sort of a rule because it's not an absolute thing. There are ecological efficiencies as low as 0.1%, and even up to 37.5% in some insects have been calculated. If you look at the two examples on the left, okay, the caterpillar is much more efficient than the mammal. And if you really think about it, it makes sense because the mammal has a lot of other needs to spend cellular respiration energy on. Only a small amount is going to growth, and only that growth amount can be consumed by the next trophic level. So we'll look more at this when we do it in class. But that 10% is going to apply to something like a food chain. So plants are able to absorb about 1% of the solar energy on the planet, and then that becomes 100% of the available energy for the next level. So if I had that, then the primary consumers, that will be 100% of the energy available to the consumers. Okay, then the carnivore, this shrew or whatever that is, will have about 10%. The snake will have 1%. The hawk will have 0.1%. That loss of energy, that inefficiency, limits the length of a food chain in both terrestrial and aquatic environments. When you start tying that in with other things, other options that could consume and eat, okay, you end up with the food web version. Just realize that the arrows are pointing from where the energy is coming from to where the energy is going to. Ultimately, every single one of these steps will be inefficient due to the loss of energy and thermodynamics, and ultimately everything will be decomposed and the matter will cycle around again in the end. Okay, so that efficiency is something to calculate there. So like I said, 1,000,000 joules, okay, roughly 1% captured by the producer, 10%, 10%, 10%. That pyramid of energy is a factor of that. Again, the 10% is a nice average, not an absolute. There are other sort of examples of trophic efficiency that can occur. Looking at the bottom right, for example, the primary consumers are significantly higher in level than the primary producers, and that doesn't really make sense. But when you think about it, what it really means is that the producers, which are the base of this pyramid, are only alive to this sort of certain amount, but they're reproducing faster. So the turnover time, this sort of standing crop biomass, is less. So the producers are replicating faster than the consumers, but the consumers are consuming so many of them, it's not really the same sort of structure. But you also might have a factor where you look at consumers and producers, but the producer is on a massive scale, like it's an oak tree, and you're looking at all the bugs that live on the oak tree. Well, there's only one oak tree. So the pyramids can be strange. Think about what you're looking at, what kind of energy you're looking at, what size of organism it is, how fast it reproduces. All of these are going to be factors of trophic efficiency. So energy flows, but matter cycles. So matter cycles, or the biogeochemical cycles, these are going to be a major portion of this matter. Okay, the water cycle, we're not going to spend a great deal of time on because you should be aware, but you need to focus on where the matter is stored, the reservoirs, why it matters, and the human alterations to that impact. For the water cycle, for example, the water is essential to life. We are aqueous organisms. It's in liquid form typically, fresh water, salt water, ice. It's in the atmosphere. Okay, that's going to be sort of major reservoirs. Precipitation, runoff, evaporation, transpiration, condensation. You should know the parts of that. Okay, water is essential, but it's also a greenhouse gas, so it helps moderate climate. It sculpts our landscapes. It's a good solvent. It's a natural purifier, the water cycle, so you clean water as you go. How are humans altering it? Well, we're using it faster than nature can replenish it. We have pollution. We have reduced infiltration because of paved surfaces. Okay, so humans are altering the water cycle in many different ways. The carbon cycle is another one that we're not going to spend a great deal of time on because you should be familiar with the process. Carbon is found all over. It's in the atmosphere as a gas. It's in dirt as like carbonate rocks. Okay, it's fixed in organisms by photosynthesis and then cell respiration, cycles it back and forth. It's in terrestrial and marine systems all throughout, with the ocean being the largest reservoir of carbon in forms like calcium carbonate and dissolved CO2 and limestone and so on. Carbon is the basic building block for the four major macromolecules. That is also a greenhouse gas, and too much of a greenhouse gas is a bad thing. Um, Humans, we are digging up CO2 in huge quantities as fossil fuels. It took millions of years to fix that carbon and to biosequester it away, to lock it away. But overall, the structures and things, we're burning it faster than it can be locked away again. The clear cutting of carbon absorbing vegetation has released large amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. The increased concentration of carbon dioxide and other gases in our atmosphere is warming the planet and is projected to change the Earth's climate in this century. So the carbon cycle, fairly straightforward. One of the most tested cycles is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is absolutely essential for things like farming and nutrient acquisition because nitrogen, while it's very common in the atmosphere, is N2, it cannot be readily absorbed. It's a diatomic nitrogen. It's fully bonded. So we rely upon things like electrical discharges and bacteria to make nitrogen available for plants. Animals will consume the plants to obtain their nitrogen, but the reservoir, the main reservoir, is the atmosphere. Okay, there's a mnemonic for the nitrogen cycle, FNAD and PAN. The word on the left, FNAD, is the process, and PAN on the right is the product. Okay, so overall, you have fixation, which makes ammonia. You have nitrification, which turns ammonia into nitrates and nitrites. Okay, then you have assimilation, the actual uptake of nitrates and nitrites by plants to produce proteins and nucleic acids, because we need nitrogen for those amino groups. So without it, two of the four macromolecules can't exist. Okay, those three steps are when the organism is alive. The last two are after death. So ammonification is part of the decomposition process where those proteins and nucleic acids will be turned into ammonia, and then they will be denitrified into nitrogen gas and returned to the atmosphere. If you really break it down, all of these steps are driven primarily by bacteria. Assimilation could also be done by plants, but the fixation, nitrification, ammonification, denitrification are all carried out by different forms of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And without them, we would have problems. Humans, we are altering this. Well, nitrogen is a key nutrient. It's a limiting factor, so we dig up a lot of nitrogen and we use it in fertilizers. Okay, we add nitric oxide to the atmosphere as we burn fuels. Okay, so all of these things are putting excess nitrogen into the environment. Too much nitrogen in the water will lead to eutrophication. Okay, and that is a problem looking at productivity of organisms. Okay, also nitrogen in the atmosphere will turn into nitric acid, which will be a major contributor to acid rain, which is a problem as well. The phosphorus cycle is a simpler one. This is the only one of the ones we're looking at that does not have a gaseous component. You're really just looking at dust at the most. It's a very slow cycle and it's non-global because there is no gas. Water is going to carry it around and all that kind of thing, but we need phosphorus. We need it for nutrients. We need it for nucleic acids and bones and teeth and phosphate groups for DNA and energy like ATP. Humans, we mine phosphate salts, which are added to fertilizers, and excess phosphates will run off, causing things like algal blooms and eutrophication, as well as nitrogen. Nitrogen and phosphorus are two of the three major limiting nutrients for agriculture. The sulfur cycle is somewhat similar to the nitrogen cycle because of its sort of gaseous component and acid rain connection. Volcanoes release sulfur dioxide, decomposers release sulfur dioxide, um, that kind of thing. But sulfur is an essential nutrient. We need it for proteins and enzymes and keratin and all sorts of structures. But we humans are releasing sulfuric acid, sulfuric gases into the atmosphere and into water. That is turning into acid rain, acid deposition, and sulfur is a problem there. Overall, though, matter is a cycle. Okay, the nutrients are going into the ecosystems, but they will eventually return around and around and around again. Energy flows and matter cycles. Decomposition is the process by which organic substances are broken down into simpler organic matter. And the process is part of this structure. And the speed at which decomposition occurs varies greatly. Factors such as temperature, humidity, and season all determine how fast a fresh body will skeletonize or mummify or decompose. And Casper's law, sort of a base ratio that drives this, says that if all other factors are equal, then when there is free access of air, a body decomposes twice as fast than if it is immersed in water and 8 times faster than if it is buried in the earth. So like for example in New Orleans, they bury the bodies in the above ground mausoleums. They break down faster. They can then use the mausoleums over and over again as there wasn't enough ground. So they're going to decompose slower in water and even slower in the ground because of air access, bacterial access, all of these structures. Temperature will obviously have a major impact. As temperature is low, decomposition will slow. It freezes. Okay, so decomposition rates can be affected. If you're in a temperate rainforest, that's going to be a very different decomposition rate than if you were in a tropical rainforest or in a tundra. Okay, so just things to keep in mind. But ultimately, everything dies and is decomposed, and that matter will cycle around again.